Hi, everyone. I can see some people from Manchester, Newcastle, Leeds, Sweden, Ireland, Indonesia. Oh, wow. We're really international today. Sheffield, Indiana, Strathclyde, Norway. Oh, fantastic. Thank you for introducing yourselves, everyone. Okay, so I think now that most people have joined, I'll pass over to our webinar chair. I'd like to introduce you all to Professor Sherilyn McGregor, the Director of the Just Centre.
Great, thanks, Diane, and hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us to celebrate the launch of the Just Centre. We had an in-person launch in March at the People's History Museum in Manchester, which was a very successful way to introduce the centre to audiences locally. The purpose of today's event is to introduce the centre and our research agenda to a much wider audience. And we're going to do so by way of a conversation among some of our members, just 4 out of a really large team. In the center, we have 25 researchers from 5 universities, 8 non-academic partner organizations, an advisory board, and a large group of international academic critical friends, some of whom I think have joined us today, so a special welcome to them. Just has been funded by the ESRC, UKRI, after we won the competition for a research center on sustainable and equitable low carbon living. And we responded to this call with a bold vision. We intend to move the net zero debate onto new terrain, shifting the focus from techno fixes and individual behavior change towards building collective capacity for transformative change by joining up the decarbonization agenda with strategies for redressing intersecting socioeconomic and spatial inequalities. And we're doing this using an approach that's participatory and sensitive to local contexts and relationships. We're working on the ground in 5 places across the north of England to find out what works where, how, and for whom in the UK's holistic, just transition to a fairer and more inclusive low-carbon society. But while we are aiming for innovation and new ideas, we are also mindful that much of this is not new. We are building on a much longer tradition of environmental justice, an intellectual and activist movement that has for many decades called for joining up justice and sustainability. It is called not just for equality of opportunity to live well on a finite planet, but for just outcomes for all, which requires structural change in power relations, requires redistribution, reparation, recognition, and fair democratic processes. And this is why we're very honored to have Professor Julian Ageman here today as our keynote speaker. Julian has also generously agreed to serve as the chair of the Just Centre's International Academic Critical Friends Group. By way of a very brief introduction, Julian is a professor in the Department of Urban and Environmental Planning and Policy at Tufts University in the US, but he's also a very proud Yorkshireman. Importantly, Julian developed the influential concept of just sustainabilities in the early 2000s and has researched how to mobilize this important concept in policy planning and practice. He's also a world leader on anti-racist planning in and for co-produced intercultural and sharing cities. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Julian to present. He'll speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to some comments by 3 Just co-investigators. So over to you, Julian, and also just to remind people to please put Q&A questions, in the chat, and not in the chat, in the Q&A function, and a reminder of the survey that Doyen has also put a link to in the chat. So Julian, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Sherilyn. Thanks to the Just Centre for appointing me as chair of the International Critical Friends Group, and happy to be with you. So I'm thinking about the concept of just sustainabilities and just transition. And really what I want to do is just give you some of my thoughts, my key thoughts about the intersections between just transition as just sustainabilities. But before I start, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their futures, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. So let me give you a little bit of the history of just sustainabilities. This was the book really that I think changed the game in many ways. And what we were trying to do with this book was to introduce to what was a new concept in the United States in the early 2000s, the sustainability concept. We really wanted to introduce the justice elements that environmental justice had laid bare to us, because really the dominant narrative in the early 2000s was environmental sustainability. And of course, environment is very important, but it's not everything. We could legislate for a green world, but would it be any more socially just? A good example in the United States is the city of Minneapolis. It's probably the second greenest city after Portland, Oregon. And yet Minneapolis is in no way one of the more socially just cities. In fact, it's one of the least socially just cities. So green and social justice do not go together automatically. We can have green, socially just cities, but we actually have to work at that. It doesn't just follow. So this book really broke new ground. It tried to bring together concepts of environmental quality and human equality. And we were arguing that sustainability can't simply be a green or environmental concern, important though those green aspects are. We were saying that a truly sustainable society is one where questions of social need, social welfare, and economic opportunity are integrally related to the very real environmental limits of supporting ecosystems. And, we were thinking that this book should really deliver a new narrative, and it has stood the test of time. It's nearly 25 years old now, and it's, well, it's way overdue an update, but we'll have to think about that in the future. But I just want to go back to a book in 2009 that I think deserves re-looking at. This book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone, really, I think, broke new ground before Piketty and all the others came along. What it did was it looked at data from about 150 countries worldwide, and it looked at the issue of inequality. And the researchers found a very interesting thing. The greater the inequality within a nation, the more social malaise there was. Everything from teen pregnancies to high school dropout to domestic violence to drug addiction and abuse. They increased with increasing inequality. And the other thing that they found, and I don't know whether this was intentional or they just were crunching some numbers, but they looked at advertising revenues and inequality, and they found that basically advertising revenues go up as the inequality increases in a country. Advertisers, marketers, product sellers like inequality because under greater inequality, people start buying. Competitive consumption, keeping up with the Joneses. But what does competitive consumption also do? It kicks up our carbon footprint. So, there is a case to be made that inequality is a major driver of climate change. And I don't see that really being investigated so much by some of the organizations that are putting solutions forward like sustainable agriculture, sustainable transportation. Great, solutions are great, but let's acknowledge what one of the major drivers is, and that is inequality. So really, the idea of just sustainability is about really acknowledging issues of social justice are integrally related to environmental and environmental quality issues. Just sustainability is the need to ensure a better quality of life for all now and into the future in a just and equitable manner while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there's 4 conditions or criteria inherent in this definition. We must commit to improving people's quality of life and well-being. We must do this for both present and future generations. We must adopt, and I was pleased to hear Sherilyn at the beginning mention the word recognition. We must adopt a more nuanced notion of what justice is. For too long, we've thought of justice just in terms of distribution and procedure. You know, people having access to policy making, policymakers, and the process, the wheels of policy making. We also acknowledge that some people get stuff and other people don't, the distribution question. But more fundamental is the notion of recognition. If we do not recognize the rights to be of certain groups in society, how can we ever do justice by them? How can we ever reconcile? Or even further down the line, how can we ever come to any form of reparation or reparative justice? Recognition, Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Me Too, the cries for Indigenous rights. We need to see recognition as almost a precursor to justice. There can be no justice if there is no recognition. And then all of these three conditions must be carried out within ecosystem limits, the so-called one planet living criterion. Vanessa Castan-Broto and Laura Westman in 2019 wrote a book which, was, from my point of view, was excellent because they really tested my just sustainabilities theory. And they took the four criteria or conditions or pillars, if you like, and they looked around the world and they found that basically each of these criteria is being carried out. But one thing that they really made clear, and I'm glad they made it so clear, is that no place, no city was doing all four in a holistic manner. Some were doing more on ecosystem limits, some were doing more on justice, some were doing more on future generations or quality of life and well-being. But the key to just sustainability is the holistic approach to all of these. These are synergistic and sort of cumulative conditions in a sense. And yes, it's better to do ecosystem limits than not, but it's not good enough in and of itself. We want to see a spread of the different concerns of just sustainabilities in any one city's policy, planning, and practice. I just want to give myself a little pat on the back and say that just sustainabilities both underlies and predates Kate Raworth's excellent work on donor economics. And I'm not going to go through that because most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. But in her model, in her schema there, you can see just sustainabilities. The idea of not puncturing the ecological ceiling while also not letting people fall below the social foundation. So the safe and just operating space for humanity is just sustainabilities, i.e. the bagel. And similarly, hasn't the UN come a long way since 1992 and the Rio Earth Summit? We now have a very well thought out, if almost impenetrable 17 sustainable development goals. And obviously there's critiques there, but from my point of view, the recognition of issues of voice, of gender, of race, of indigeneity, they're all in the sustainable development goals now. Okay, so I'm going to finish with 6 very quick provocations that I want us to think about in the just transition work that the Centre is going to be doing over the next 5 years. Acknowledge justice-based scholarship, take spatial injustice seriously, move from racial planning to reparative planning, writing the relationship between belonging and becoming, the idea of the just transition as humane scaled as well as human scaled policy and planning. And then I want to make a final point about the need for leadership. So first, and these are all quick 1-minute points. A bunch of us wrote this recently because we were stunned that the researchers in an article that we saw paid no attention to some of the establishing scholarship, especially scholarship from people of colour, around environmental justice. And it was, we feel, a real mistake to have this published. And so Brendan Coulsat from Belgium, Brendan pulled us all together and we wrote a sort of comment about how young, especially young European researchers need to be up to speed on what has gone on especially in North America, where the environmental justice movement started. So we need to acknowledge the work that has gone by these people on whose shoulders we now stand. And as Sherilyn said, the Just Centre was founded on some of the work that they did. I think we need to take spatial injustice seriously. You know, obviously in the US, things are different. Racial segregation is built into urban planning in the US. But on the top left picture, you can see the very Tony Back Bay in Boston. If you live there, you've got a 23-year life advantage over people who live in Roxbury, bottom right. And this led, and this and other spatial injustices in US cities has led Harvard School of Public Health to say your zip code is more important than your genetic code as a predictor of health, longevity, and life chances, if you like. We must take spatial injustice seriously. And I'm really pleased to see that the Just Centre is working with disadvantaged communities in many of the US cities. Obviously, the conditions are different in different cities, but here in the US, you cannot get away from the primacy of issues of race in urban planning. We need to move from racial planning. Racialized zoning cities based on race, was only outlawed in 1917 by the Supreme Court. And then cities developed another discriminatory form of zoning called single family zoning, big lots, big houses, so that they can't afford to live there. That was what came after. And then we had redlining and all of those other segregationist and supremacist ideas. So we are seeing, and I have a student who's doing this project on mapping pathways towards restorative urban planning. She's developed a database and a GIS set of GIS maps. Change is happening, but what's happening is it's happening sector by sector. Evanston, Illinois, for instance, is adopting reparative urban planning policies in terms of its housing policy. What we want to see again is a holistic shift to a paradigm where comprehensive plans in the United States deliver reparations via the urban planning system. What are the implications for transportation? What are the implications for open space policy? We know open spaces are less frequent and of less high quality than in poor areas than they are in wealthier areas. What would reparations look like being delivered through urban planning, through comprehensive plans? And really, in summary, my point here, urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating and implementing and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. And many cities are. I mentioned Minneapolis earlier. Minneapolis's 2040 plan has as goal number one, eliminate inequalities and disparities. And you can go online and just Google Minneapolis 2040. There are 39 policy initiatives pursuant to that goal of eliminating inequalities. We have to write the relationship between belonging and becoming. We're all in the sustainability, urban planning, the just sphere. We're all thinking about what our communities can become. They can become low carbon living communities, smart, sharing, resilient, sustainable. But what we often forget is who gets to belong in our cities. In US cities and in cities around the world, we're very good at moving people on, whether they're unhoused, underhoused, homeless, whether they're migrants, certainly here in the United States now. We're very good at moving people on. We need, in the just sphere, we need to balance our efforts in terms of what cities can become, along with who gets to belong, because I don't want to be part of elite dreaming of those privileged people who can dream about what cities can become. I want a greater sense of belonging, because my belief is that cities will become more democratic, more socially inclusive, if we put more effort into who gets to belong. I think the just transition is also about humane scale policy and planning. The Congress for New Urbanism in the US talks a lot about human scale planning, but I always, in my remarks, ask people to put an E on the word human. I want the just transition to human dignity, planning that inculcates empathy, planning that facilitates our coexistence in shared space. And I want planning and justice to be about possibility, not about probability, what we've always done. If we keep doing what we've always done, we're not going to move the needle. We need to think about what is possible. And to that end, here are two books in a book series that I am editor of, the Routledge Equity, Justice and the Sustainable City series. And I see there's a lot of young PhD researchers out there. I'd love to see a manuscript at some stage in the future. But Leonie Sandercock from University of British Columbia, her excellent book, really her life's work, Mapping Possibility, Finding Purpose and Hope in Community Planning. She takes an empathetic approach to planning. She pioneered what's called therapeutic planning, planning as almost like therapy. In our book, Sacred Civics, Building Seven Generation Cities, we really look at how do we utilize indigenous and old world wisdoms in planning. We think our technical superiority is going to carry us forward. We need to revisit some older ideas. I think also leadership is really important. And, you know, I'm privileged to have as a friend and worked on the transition for Mayor Michelle Wu in Boston. Her food justice agenda, I really encourage anybody to just go online and take a look at this, because I think it illustrates several things I want to finish up with. Food justice means racial justice. The centering of racial justice within food justice is really, really important in the US because, as we know, the redlined neighborhoods where people of color largely live are also the food deserts. They're also the places where people die of heat stress because there's less green space, there's less trees, there's more large parking lots and large roads which absorb heat. But I also want to think about this in terms of, you know, we say food justice. It's not just about nutrition. Look at the issues that Mayor Wu deals with here. Public health, small business expansion, economic justice and worker rights, closing the racial wealth gap. Here in the US, I think we use often these phrases like climate justice, food justice, environmental justice to really open up wider debates about self-determination at local levels. And I think Mayor Wu's food justice agenda for a resilient Boston is a really good example of that. I want to leave you with, I suppose, the key message of Sacred Civics, and I think a message I want to really think about is this idea that our greatest challenges today are not scientific and technological. They're much deeper than that. They're spiritual and they're cultural. And I think, you know, if we can introduce these ideas into a new narrative about justice and sustainability, then we'll be doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian, for those provocations and reflections. Really valuable for us all to think about them. I'd like to now invite three Just Center co-investigators to offer some thoughts in response to Julian's presentation. Thoughts and reflections that hopefully will help give our audience a sense of the center's research agenda and the challenges and opportunities we will be responding to over the next 5 years. And let me just briefly introduce them. And I think it'll be in this order. Rebecca Willis is professor in energy and climate governance at the University of Lancaster and expert advisor to the UK government's Climate Change Committee. Stefan Bizarovsky is professor of human geography at the University of Manchester and chair of the European Union Energy Poverty Observatory. And Lucy Middlemiss is professor of Environment and Society at the University of Leeds and chair of Fair Energy Futures Initiative as part of Energy Leeds. So please do put some reflections also in the chat or questions for the speakers in the Q&A function as we go along, but I'll hand over to Becky first.
Thank you, Sherilyn, and a huge thank you to you and Doyen and Rachel and the whole Just team for setting up today and the project and what we get to do together over the next few years with such a fascinating group of academics and, more importantly, wider communities that we get to work with. I I want to start with what might see. I mean, I was fascinated, Julian, by your comments, and I want to start with what might be seen as a sort of arcane distinction between justice and fairness. The reason I want to start with that is because, as many of you know, a lot of our work at Climate Citizens in Lancaster involves bringing together representative samples of people who are representative of their city or of the country as a whole, and we talk to them about the way forward on climate. And when we ask them sort of what their guiding principles are for doing this, the number one is always fairness, right? But when you dig down a bit, conceptions of fairness vary widely, and they tend to fall down sort of lines based on sort of political worldview. And this is where I think we have a challenge on our hands, because speaking to the current political moment and polarization, I think that what we there's a danger that we unwittingly stoke that by using language of justice rather than fairness. This is partly a linguistic issue, but when you talk about things like disadvantage, diversity, even sustainability, that speaks to some that is helpful for some people's worldviews and not others. There are plenty of people who would share a lot of the same sort of underlying concerns around fairness, but who wouldn't express it in that way. And particularly a conception of fairness which always comes back is this idea of, people who are just about managing, who might be in work but still in poverty, for example, are a really important segment for people. I think that my main sort of provocation for this debate would be to, as researchers and as in fact as the policy community more widely, to really keep open a reflexiveness about our own position and our own worldviews, and not to try and assume that what we're trying to do is to get more people to think like us, but instead, and I think this was very much where you ended, Julian, but instead to look at where the shared agenda is. So, I mean, to be clear, I absolutely don't want to relitigate the language question and say we shouldn't be talking about diversity or justice. Absolutely not. I would not want to censor that in any way. But I think that when we do that, we need to be very clear about the position that we are speaking from and how that sounds to other people. So, as a specific example, because it's one of the areas we're looking at as part of the Just Centre, West Cumbria, where a coal mine was proposed and then fought through the courts, and the coal mine eventually lost. That is an ex-industrial community, sort of fiercely proud of their area, have a lot of the same values of that we might join, but talk about them in different ways. Similarly, one of my colleagues researches rural right of centre voters and their views on climate. And you can imagine that the tenor of the conversation is quite different, but again, a lot of shared agendas. So I think what I would throw into this discussion is firstly that real need to be aware of our own position and our own values, and then look at those commonalities. So I mean, absolutely, number one that I share with you, Julian, is a focus on place, and and not making this a sort of experts from above thing, but focusing on real changes on the ground. And that's an absolutely brilliant thing about the Just Centre being able to take this focus across the north of England. The point I'll end on is the importance to look at this in terms of a process of engagement, and not what you might think of as communications followed by delivery. And I've started to push back every time I hear the phrase delivery, because it's this idea that like someone somewhere gets to like invent what needs to be done, and then everyone else just has to deliver that. Like literally their job is to shove it through a letterbox and nothing else. And that to my mind completely looks over the fact that, you know, the people delivering this are living complicated lives and have a lot of other agendas, and are, you know, on both on climate and on fairness or justice, are, you know, are on side. They want to be part of this, but they have expertise about their own communities, about what works for them, and building in that lived experience and that knowledge is absolutely vital to doing this right. And I know, Lisa, you'll probably touch on this as well. And so, you know, I think when I see, and, you know, working on climate, I see probably several times a day that graph of, you know, emissions reduction going down like that to net zero. And every time I see that graph, I think about how that is divided into what you know, how things are done differently at all kinds of areas through all kinds of complex relationships between different actors, whether individual people, whether local areas, whether governments, whether research, and seeing that kind of downward graph as a kind of massively busy and bubbling and hopefully sort of very energizing conversation about what we need to do to meet that shared challenge, to me really brings alive what you know, the challenge behind the Just Centre and the challenge behind tackling climate and other other environmental and social challenges. So I'll leave it there, but really interested to hear what others say.
Thanks very much, Becky. Stefan?
Thank you. It's very inspiring to hear both Julian and Becky on this. I have a short slide just so I don't forget to say something, because my attention span isn't very good in the afternoon. So I hope you can see it. Basically, just want to say something about energy system transformation, energy transformations, which is my main area of work. Just a small correction, I don't chair the Energy Poverty Observatory anymore. It's now been folded into a wider advisory hub, so much more orientated towards citizens. So in a way, kind of following that movement that was described previously by both Becky and Julian, the more place-based, more engaged service now, focus more within the EU. But one thing I'd like to say, and to begin with, primarily also connected to what we will be doing in the Just Centre, is just to say that looking at the present state of the energy system globally, but also in the global north as well, the global south, it's just not fit for purpose. We have an energy system, and I don't want to use the word deliver, but it doesn't deliver anything. It delivers profits mostly for the powerful, and it creates inequities, and it doesn't allow, not to mention it creates massive issues around climate change. So we need a transformation of that system. Now, we don't really have the formula on how to do that transformations, but I think I can call on to certain key principles as starting points, which I would like really to sort of highlight. And a lot of those connect to, I think, what both Julian and Becky were saying. And here I just, I love that intervention that you had, Julian, on the sort of historical importance of energy justice and the struggles around it. And for me, I think that's the key thing. It is that these transformations are going to, that we are talking about, they have been born through struggle, and they will require struggle, and they are constantly the subject of struggle. And it's a struggle because we're coming up against incumbent interests. So it is by no means a techno-managerial process. It is one that actively requires engagement by all, including us as knowledge producers or knowledge brokers, but also everyone else in the wider community of practitioners and people who are daily, and I think I can see many also in the audience, daily encountering these realities. And in that sense, this struggle, I think, is a precarious one. It isn't one that's just moves in one direction. It keeps going back and forth, and we're seeing that with all of the rollback that's happening now in the US. And I think we're going to see also in Europe, in some ways, we are seeing it already through the focus on defense and security. And we're seeing it globally in other ways. So it's not a one-way process, but we have to keep reminding ourselves that we can't give up, that this is a process that requires constantly being engaged and constantly working on that sort of line of the current system that doesn't like to move, doesn't want to relent any space in terms of the power relations, in terms of the vested interests that exist. And in that sense, I think there's two other things that I wanted to say here, which is that actually it requires a lot of labor. It requires a lot of care, this transformation. And we have highlighted, and we have mentioned a few people who worked on this. And it's labor that's that's emotional labor. It's labor that is often very gendered, very racialized. It has been in the past and continues to be so. And that's just something that we'll have to, I think we have to acknowledge, we have to foreground in our work, but we have to make it visible as well. And around that also, it's that labor is collaborative, it's relational, to build on some of Lucy's, not to mention, I mean, obviously I'm mentioning Lucy, our next speaker, but not to foreshadow, but Lucy's done amazing work on this relational approach around energy. And that, again, is for me very indicative of the kind of direction of travel. We have to do this together, and we have to do it through a collaborative process, just like in the past. But the other thing I wanted to say also here is that the outcomes of just transformations are not predetermined, nor are they equal. So they're highly variegated. The word pluriverse has been mentioned a few times, that there are multiple opportunities for change and transformation, and those changes are very, and I believe Becky mentioned that those changes are in many ways place dependent, they're place-based, they're contextual. And I think that's something, again, that would guide our work in the new center, the fact that the way we look at transformations will be very much dependent on local circumstances, but also the lived experiences of transformation in different places. So that's just, I guess, to highlight some of the direction of travel in which we will do this work. I should mention that within the center, I co-lead the infrastructures, very much the social infrastructures theme with Dr. Claire Coonahan from University of Manchester. And we will be looking to highlight, to foreground, to explore these infrastructures that guide just transformations across different places within, of course, our case study area, but also globally. And those social infrastructures you like, we want to think of them not as just including the usual suspects, not just the ways in which we demand or produce energy or other forms of resources, but also the everyday lived realities, the political processes through which transformations are produced and lived, and also the forms of labor, care, and love. So that's from me. I hope I hope to be collaborating and discussing these themes with you. And thank you to the other speakers for these very helpful interventions. Thanks. I'll stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stefan. And last but not least, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn. So I was tasked with saying a few words about the methodological challenges that we face in JUST and how we're going to respond to them. So sort of look ahead to our future plans in a slightly more concrete way. So from the speakers you've heard already, you'll see that we collectively believe that joined up sustainability transformations come out of places, then also are dependent on key actors working together with diverse communities to both envision and then deliver on transformative change. And I think there are a number of methodological challenges that arise from this starting point. Actually, I think it's a pretty exciting space to occupy. It feels to me that we have to break research boundaries in the JUST Centre to allow us to meet our ambitious goals for social transformation and to make it really work for our research partners, resulting in the social impact that we prize quite highly in this work. So in other words, methodological innovation here is necessary to make the best of our research. And I'm just going to make 4 short points about methodological challenges and how we're going to rise to them. So firstly then, co-production requires us to respond to different timeframes. And when I look around myself at the moment, there's huge interest in the various forms of justice and injustice in the climate space. People are actively trying to work on how to join up their actions on climate with social justice priorities now. The fact they're doing this now leads to a need for faster paced outputs to shape action. And we're keen to get started as quickly as possible in this space, but this is a challenging position to be in as an academic because it requires us to work more iteratively and to be happy to share work in progress rather than only sharing the polished end product. And we will be sharing work in progress in this first year with you, so please do watch this space. Secondly, we're doing mixed methods research here in order to learn from the deep work we do with particular communities and to be able to apply lessons about that work elsewhere. We want to genuinely mix our methods, ensuring that qualitative and quantitative data are in conversation, bridging those tensions between data science and synthesis and the more participatory methods is always challenging, but it's also our biggest opportunity because we think our work has the potential to transfer learning from one place to another in a place and person sensitive manner. We're already deep into the quantitative work in which we aim to get a better understanding of who is doing what where in the north of England. This in itself is a novel contribution, so we're bringing together environmental and social data sets to create new forms of understanding about people's readiness for net zero, also in place. And participatory work will draw on this to explore how we can effect change during the life of our centre. Thirdly, then, we're looking to build long relationships with our partners in each of the Just Places, engaging with communities over the 5 years of the centre. I think this is challenging because we don't want to be bothering people, but it's also hugely important as a means of ensuring research is genuinely with, not on, these communities. Part of the work is about building capacity for participants and partners to do research and to help them to shape research agendas, but also for us to be accountable to our partners in the design, delivery and analysis. And we have a really fabulous group of partners that we're already working with and we will be building new partnerships in each place and nationally in the coming months and years. So then finally, I just want to conclude by pointing out that we live in interesting times and the challenges we face in this centre are likely to shift over time. As we began the work, most of the keywords associated with centre, so climate, environmental justice, etc., were targeted by the incoming US government with funding cuts to researchers in the US associated with that. And then for us, taking these conversations about climate and social justice to the public puts us in an interesting and sometimes challenging position, I think, in the coming years. Personally, I think we have a real opportunity here to be shaping a public conversation on this topic, but we may face resistance to it, as others have pointed out, as well as needing to find ways into having such a conversation with people who have a range of political starting points. In my view, though, how the public conversation plays out in the coming years is likely to shape the politics of the decades to come. And at the Just Centre, I think we have a hope and a aspiration to have a really productive role in that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now looking at the time, we've only got about 10 minutes. And I think what we'd like to do is hear 1 or 2 questions that have been upvoted by the audience. Diane, if you want to read out just maybe the top 2, and then we'll have a round of a few reflections or perhaps response from the speakers.
All right, so I think the top kind of questions are, there's one from Joe asking about, he's saying his local experience suggests that justice is often complex and controversial in practice, e.g., for example, ethnic cultures, which can be misogynistic or materialistic. Is there any insight on how to work with such contradictions? And then I think the second question would be about how can we engage with people or community groups in local and vulnerable areas in our research for a more just future in a way that we're not being simply extractive of those communities.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe I'll ask Julian if you'd like to give a response to those 2 questions and perhaps reflect on what Becky, Stefan and Lucy have said.
Yeah, yeah. Doyen, can you just give me the second question again? I got the first one, the second one.
Yeah. How do we ensure that by including and engaging with people, community groups in different areas, local and vulnerable, in our research for a more just future, what can we do to ensure that we're not simply being extractive?
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, what's come out very clearly for me here is that the word justice in the United States is a very powerful word. You know, in 1982, the Reverend Benjamin Chavis was on a TV program and he came out with the phrase environmental racism. Immediately, you had an issue. The civil rights movement picked it up. And I think a really key issue here is that the US had and has a civil rights movement. Britain doesn't. And any injustice that you can flag and that gets national attention, you can bet the civil rights movement will pick it up. And that's why environmental justice became such a strong rallying cry. So, you know, issues of fairness, equality, they are lesser cries in the United States. If you can invoke injustice, it seems to really plug into a renewable power supply, which is the civil rights movement. You align your issues with justice and civil rights, and you've got a major issue that will go not just, you know, into advocacy circles, but will go into politics, will go, you know, into the courts and into, you know, lawyers and, you know, decision makers' hands. So yes, but I do see the relational and context specific case. And this is why I use the plural just sustainabilities rather than just sustainability, because I acknowledge that those four principles of just sustainabilities, you know, are principles that can happen anywhere, but the shape of just sustainabilities will look different in different cultural, ethnic, religious, gendered, or whatever political contexts. In terms of extractivity, there was a paper just come out recently. In fact, I just put it on my Blue Sky account, really talking about how, you know, we as academics, we have this language, but yet, you know, if we want to talk about climate change at local levels, we have to go in with the language that people relate to. And I think, you know, we can decrease our extractivity by, you know, working on those languages and working with the vocabularies that are coming up from the ground. And I've got to say, this is why Mayor Wu was elected in Boston. She really amplified community voices rather than coming in with a mayoral agenda and saying, okay, gang, fit into my agenda. She amplified community voices, and that's why she's a successful mayor and why she's made such change. She also is the architect of Boston's Green New Deal, which was a hugely popular vote winner for her, especially with people like my students, people in their 20s, 30s. I'll leave it there because time's pushing on. Lucy, Rebecca, Stefan.
I think that your last point touches on what Becky was talking about. So I don't know if Becky, you want to come back in about language and how to think about these new messages, the new narratives that Julian was talking about in his presentation, but so what's going to work in the UK context?
The thing I'm thinking about, and I'm not qualified to answer, is the different histories of the UK and the US, particularly in terms of racial justice. And I just leave that hanging because I'm really struck, Julian, by what you say about the civil rights movement in the US, and I think it is different here, but I know enough about it to know that I don't know about it. I think the question about whether, you know, the dangers of being extractive of local communities is absolutely spot on. Like a couple of things to guard against there. One is, you know, I think Lucy was talking about our sort of action research approach. I think the more that we can do to actually spotlight examples of local policies or approaches which guard against extractiveness, I don't know. One of them is some really interesting stuff around participatory budgeting, where you actually hand over control of pots of money to communities. And another one is again something that is happening in West Cumbria, and they spoke at the in-person launch around community ownership of renewable energy. So I think what the challenge for us as researchers and for policymakers is what are we prepared to cede control over? And and I would link that to Stefan's point. And Stefan, I'm really glad you made this point, because I try and get it into every talk and failed this time, is like, we need to be crystal clear as well about power and incumbency and how that works, and to try and make our work about shining a light on that and looking at ways that we can oh God, the phrase that just popped into my head was take back control. But I mean, that is what it is, right?
That might not resonate with American audience members, but it might. Lucy or Stefan, do you want to come in with a short sort of reflection on those points? Lucy.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fairness, justice, and the specific language that we use, and I think we need to go a bit beyond that. And Julian talked about narratives. In the work we've done in this space, I feel like we don't actually have just sustainabilities as visions of the future. We have one vision of the future, and when people look at that vision, they can't necessarily see themselves and their lives reflected in it. Not least, not just in the future, they can't see their present lives reflected in it, or their histories. Those histories of whatever they might contain. And so I think one of our really important roles here is to go into sustainabilities rather than sustainability, because we have this opportunity to work with diverse communities across the north of England who have different interests, different visions of what good looks like. And I think the current visions of what good looks like feel quite alien to a lot of people. It's kind of solar panels and heat pumps, and neither of those things are either potentially in my reach and they might feel extremely risky. What about everything else? What about the fact that the local bus service is terrible? I live in Leeds, this is true. What about the fact that that my kids go to the school and they're getting bullied, or there's all sorts of other issues that people have in their heads. And there's a lot of connections between everything and this change that we're envisaging. But we need sustainabilities, as Julian has always put it, we don't need sustainability.
And this sort of connects to Stefan's point about pluriversality and openness to things that emerge through collaborative research. And so do you have a final word on that, Stefan, perhaps?
I mean, just to say really that with language, I think we have to work with the people who, we have to use language, and because that seems to have been the point that everyone's mentioning. Language has to be defined and thought of around this in a collaborative way. One of the challenges, I use the term, so we've just published a perspective around this. Sorry for the plug, but we said. We used to use the word fuel poverty or energy poverty, but we wouldn't say it in front of the people who we were working with, because people didn't want to be called poor or rich or whatever, and that's one of the challenges. So the language and the terms and narratives we use have to, that it has to start from there. It has to be started in a collaborative way already from the beginning, and it might be that there's going to be very different words in different contexts, because they are contingent upon particular circumstances. So maybe that's what we will do in Just. We might have different narratives for each of our case study areas. So please forgive us if that's the case.
Yes. I think we need to start to close. So I want to end by saying thank you again to Julian for being our keynote speaker today. And thank you to our co-Is, Stefan, Becky, and Lucy for their contributions. And thank you to everyone who's attended today for your participation, your contributions. We'll really look forward to reading the comments that you've put in the chat and the responses that you've made to our survey questions, which we will really look at with interest. Obviously, we couldn't address all of your questions, but they'll be really helpful to us as we think about our work going forward. I want to give us very special thanks to Doyen Mansell and Rachel Colley for their invaluable work to coordinate the webinar today. This webinar has been recorded, so will be available to watch online. So if you want to share it with others, we'll watch the space for a link. And we hope that everyone who's come today will keep in touch and follow the work of the Just Center. Our website is still under construction, but that's one way for you to follow our progress, as is our newsletter, which you should be able to sign up to from the website, or else Doyen might let us know in a minute how to sign up to the newsletter. And then other than that, I just want to say thank you very much again, and take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Doyen, do you want to just give a final, do you want to let people know how they can keep in touch with the newsletter?
Yes, of course. So people should be able to sign up from the website from about next week. It's not live just yet, but people were asked as part of their registration for this whether they wanted to sign up for the newsletter. So if you said yes there, thank you very much, and you will have been subscribed. Otherwise, you can just drop an email to the just@manchester.ac.uk email, and we will subscribe you to our newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, do you want to say goodbye? You're hiding in the background. Don't know if you can.
I can. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been such a pleasure to exchange with you, and you'll be hearing more from Justin. We hope to hear more from you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Take care. Bye.